This is not a book review. We're not here to ask whether this book is good. We're here to ask what happens when ordinary people believe it. And in the case of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, the answer is a lot messier and a lot riskier than the success story makes it sound. This is one of the most famous money books ever written. It sold financial freedom. It sold escape. It sold the feeling that maybe you weren't broke because you failed. Maybe you were broke because nobody taught you the real rules. And that part hit millions of people hard. But this book didn't just wake people up. It also taught a lot of normal workers to romanticize leverage, chase fake passive income, and feel ashamed of stable work. And that is where things get dangerous. As a mindset wake-up call, sure. As actual money advice for burnt-out people in the real world, that's where this starts to fall apart. So this isn't a lazy hit piece. Some of this book helped people. That's exactly why the bad parts matter. Today, we're breaking down what Rich Dad, Poor Dad got right, what it got very wrong, and why so much of its advice becomes dangerous the moment regular people try to live by it. To understand why this book exploded, you have to understand the feeling it spoke to. You wake up early. You commute. You work. You pay bills. You try to be responsible. And somehow it still feels like the money disappears the second it arrives. Rent, gas, groceries, insurance, debt, repeat. For a lot of people, Rich Dad, Poor Dad felt like the first book that said, "You're not crazy." The game really is different from what they told you. That message landed because it touched a real nerve. It gave people language for something they already felt. That working hard and being responsible did not automatically lead to freedom. And that is why the book became more than a book. It became a worldview. It told people there were two kinds of lives: the life of the person who stays trapped, and the life of the person who sees the hidden rules. That is powerful. And honestly, that is why so many people loved it. But here's the problem. A book can be emotionally true and still be financially dangerous. And Rich Dad, Poor Dad lives right in that gap. Before we get into the damage, let's be fair. This book got a few big things right. First, it gave people a name for the treadmill. The rat race idea worked because it was real. A lot of people were not irresponsible. They were just stuck in a system where income came in and got swallowed immediately. The book gave that feeling a simple name. That mattered. Second, it made people think differently about what they buy. Its version of assets versus liabilities is oversimplified. Real accounting is more nuanced than that. But as a beginner's mental model, it helped. It pushed people to ask a better question. Is this thing helping my future or quietly draining me every month? That's useful. Third, it told people not to rely on one income source forever. The idea of building skills, savings, or side income over time, that part still holds up. Not because everyone needs to become a founder, not because everyone should become a landlord, but because having options matters. So yes, this book got some big things right. And that's exactly why the wrong parts were so influential. Now let's get into the red flags. The first red flag is that it sells shame before strategy. One of the most damaging things this book did was not financial. It was psychological. Because Rich Dad, Poor Dad doesn't just teach a money framework, it quietly teaches a status hierarchy. And in that hierarchy, the person with a normal job starts to look like the loser. If you have a salary, if you work for someone else, if you are not buying properties or building cash-flowing assets in your sleep, then suddenly you're the one who doesn't get it. And that message has poisoned a lot of people's brains. Because, let's be honest, being a teacher is not failure, being a nurse is not failure, being an engineer is not failure, being the person who keeps hospitals, schools, systems, and actual life running is not failure. That is civilization. A paycheck is not embarrassing. For a lot of people, it is the reason life stays stable. Healthcare, rent, food, predictability, a little peace. And yet this book helped feed a whole culture that made stable work look weak and risk look noble. That is not wisdom. That is branding. Because the book doesn't just sell strategy, it sells identity. And a lot of normal people walked away feeling like they had to become mini tycoons just to deserve respect. That is a terrible foundation for making financial decisions. The second red flag is that it sells passive income like therapy. Then there's the fantasy that might have done the most damage. Passive income. The phrase sounds peaceful. It sounds like relief. It sounds like the end of burnout. And that's exactly why exhausted people love it. But a lot of passive income is not passive. It is active stress with better marketing. Rental property can mean repairs, vacancies, taxes, bad tenants, surprise costs, insurance headaches, and yes, sometimes a toilet problem at 2 a.m. Online business is usually not passive. It's content, marketing, tech problems, customer support, and constant uncertainty. Side hustle income, most of the time, is not freedom. It is a second shift. And this matters because the people most attracted to passive income are often the people with the least energy left. They're already tired, already stressed, already barely holding the week together. So when you sell passive income as the answer to burnout, what you're often really selling is more work to people who can least absorb the cost. That does not mean extra income is bad. It means the fantasy is dishonest. Because for most people, passive income is not a soft escape hatch. It is messy, active, risky, and emotionally expensive. That's not freedom. That's stress with better branding. The third red flag is that the tactics came from a different planet. A huge part of this book's advice came out of a totally different economic world. And that matters more than fans want to admit. Real estate in the 1980s is not real estate now. Different housing costs, different lending standards, different competition, different rates, different taxes, different insurance costs, different wage-to-housing math, different everything. So when people hear old zero-down style stories and treat them like timeless wisdom, that is not bold. That is dangerous. What looked aggressive but possible decades ago can be financially suicidal now. And this is where survivorship bias sneaks in. You hear from the person who won. You do not hear from the thousands of people who copied the same mindset, made the same moves, and got crushed quietly. That is how money mythology works. It spotlights the survivor. It hides the graveyard. And if you build your financial life on stories that only make sense in a different era, you are not getting a blueprint. You are getting nostalgia disguised as strategy. The fourth red flag is that the book romanticizes leverage. Now we get to the most dangerous part, leverage. This is the idea that makes people feel smart right before things go wrong, because yes, leverage can multiply gains, but it also multiplies mistakes, it multiplies pressure, it multiplies timing risk, and when life goes sideways, it multiplies damage. That is not theory. That is what happened to real families. For years, people were told that debt could be good, that borrowing aggressively was just what financially educated people did, that appreciation would handle the rest. And then 2008 happened. Jobs disappeared. House prices fell. Payments stayed real. Families got trapped. That is the part glossy money stories always skip. They skip the panic, the layoffs, the repairs, the refinancing problems, the rate shock, the midnight fight between two scared adults trying to figure out what happens next. Debt looks elegant in a spreadsheet. It feels very different in a crisis. And this is why good debt gets talked about way too casually. Because debt is not confidence. Debt is obligation. And obligation gets very ugly when your income drops, your costs rise, or your timing is off. This is where Rich Dad, Poor Dad becomes more than simplistic. It becomes reckless. Because the people most likely to copy its leverage logic are not billionaires with margin for error. They are ordinary people looking for a way out. And ordinary people do not survive financial mistakes the same way rich people do. So if this book is not a safe manual for most people, what actually is? Not a fantasy, not a flex, not some fake escape-the-matrix performance, something slower, something less sexy, something that still works when you're tired. First, automate pay yourself first. You do not need a dramatic reinvention. You need a system. Even 5% is fine if that's where you start. Not because 5% is magic, but because automation beats motivation. A quiet system that moves money before you spend it will do more for most people than 100 hours of hype. Second, find the cash leaks without turning it into shame. Look at the last 30 to 60 days, not to punish yourself, to see clearly. What keeps draining money without actually making life better? Subscriptions you forgot, stress spending, convenience habits, tiny leaks that turn into monthly blood loss. Most people do not have a character problem, they have a systems problem. That matters. Third, use the one kind of leverage banks can't take from you. Skills, useful, transferable, income-raising skills. Writing, sales, editing, communication, automation, design, project management, technical skills that make you more valuable. No bank can foreclose on your skill stack. And unlike reckless leverage, this kind of leverage usually has limited downside and long-term upside. More options, better pay, a stronger fallback plan, more control. And for most normal people, control is a lot more valuable than looking rich. So here's the verdict. Rich Dad. Poor Dad is not useless. As a mindset alarm clock, it worked. It made people question the treadmill. It made people think about ownership. It made people ask whether the default path was enough. That mattered. But as a real-world financial manual for ordinary people, it is way riskier than its fans like to admit. Because once you move past the mindset layer, the book starts pushing people toward shame, fantasy, outdated tactics, and a dangerously casual attitude toward debt. That is not freedom. That is confusion mixed with confidence, which is one of the most expensive combinations in personal finance. You do not need to become a real estate hero. You do not need to perform entrepreneurship to prove you understand money. You do not need to borrow your way into anxiety and call it education. You can build a better financial life slowly, quietly, safely, without worshipping risk. And honestly, that path might look less impressive online, but it usually feels a lot better in real life. So yes, use Rich Dad. Poor Dad is an alarm clock if you want. Just do not mistake it for a blueprint, because a book can wake you up and still point you in the wrong direction. That staying in the game matters more than looking clever.